Now, in the aftermath of that attack in Kyiv, Ukraine's president is cutting short his visit to South Africa. The trip is Zelensky's first on the African continent and comes as Kyiv seeks to forge new alliances as fears mount that Washington's goals have started to shift. South Africa's president, meanwhile, says the path to peace in Ukraine is through diplomacy.
And we call upon all parties, both Russia and Ukraine, to ensure that there is a comprehensive ceasefire, an unconditional ceasefire, so that discussions and negotiations can start between the two countries. President Zelensky, as he himself will say, told me that as Ukraine, they are ready to engage in discussions and negotiations.
We can now bring in Olexiy Haran, Professor of Comparative Politics at Kyiv Mohyla University. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us on the program today. Why is Volodymyr Zelensky making this trip to South Africa now?
Well, it's not off the cuff. Look, we have a strategy in Africa as well as in other countries of the so-called Global South. Definitely we need support from these countries, and they demonstrated this support. So if you take into account the resolutions in the United Nations, more than 140 countries, they recognize territorial integrity of Ukraine, including Crimea, and only 4 or 5 are sided with Russia. So I think that this is very important for the countries of Africa and other countries in the Global South, because it means that no country should be attacked by the greater country, the larger country, or the superpower with nuclear weapons. Okay, so I think this is a very bad precedent for the whole international order. Ukraine gave up nuclear weapons in exchange for territorial guarantees from Russia and from the United States, as well as the UK. And it doesn't work at all. So what does it show? It creates a precedent, again, very dangerous precedent for the whole world. Then any who is greater, who is larger, who has nuclear power can attack others. So it's very important to come back to international order and respect the international law. So I think this is a general framework, for all the countries. If you're talking about Africa, so there are some specific points like food security, like nuclear security, ecological security, because Russians are now occupying the largest nuclear power station in Europe, in Zaporizhzhia, the largest one. What they are doing there? If anything happens there,
But
it
Olexiy,
would be the whole catastrophe.
does Ukraine expect South Africa to pick a side? Because it doesn't seem like they have. He's talking about diplomacy.
Yeah, that's right. But look, I was talking about resolutions, and in most resolutions, South Africa abstained. But the resolution which was adopted in February this year, on the peace resolution in Ukraine, South Africa joined it and voted in favor, while Russia definitely was against, and United States abstained. So this is very important, for important change, I would say, in South Africa position. Moreover, I would say that, yes, South Africa is participating in the process of returning deported children from Russia to Ukraine, exchange of prisoners, and other humanitarian stuff. So I do not expect that President Ramaphosa started to criticize directly Mr. Putin, but South Africa voted for the revolution, which recognized a full-scale invasion from the Russian Federation. So it's a delicate balance for South African policy, but I think it's very important, this vote. If you compare it with what Brazil is abstaining, for example, India is abstaining.
Yeah.
So I think this is important change in South African position.
Because in the past, we've had South Africa that has been neutral, as I said, but there were tensions with Kyiv back in December 2022 after the U.S. ambassador to South Africa said a Russian ship was loaded with ammunition in Cape Town, but then an internal investigation actually found that Russia was supplying weapons to South Africa, weapons that they had purchased. Given that Russia does provide arms to many states in the global south, will Kyiv have to understand the reluctance that many states have when it comes to standing up to Moscow?
Okay, look, first of all, if we analyze the votes, especially initial votes on the territorial integrity of Ukraine, more than half of African countries support territorial integrity of Ukraine. Only 2 countries, they voted together with Russia, but the others abstained. That's true. So I would say here that, look, definitely Africa is not in position to supply weapons to Ukraine or to impose economic sanctions on Russia. We understand why. But in other issues, they can participate. Russia is using, is using corrupt money and shadow schemes in order to corrupt African politicians, in order to spread fake information throughout the continent. So they have money; they can do that. They don't respect the both international law and don't respect democracy in all these countries. So at the same time, Ukraine definitely do not have such resources. That's right. But we have a word of truce on our side. And I think this will be echoed by African attitude towards Ukraine. Because what is important, in the case of Ukraine, we see the former colonial empire, the Russian Empire, which is coming back and trying again to impose its will on independent territory. I think if we use this language, Africans definitely would understand what does it mean for Ukraine. We are fighting for freedom in the same way as many countries fought for their independence.
Olexiy, yesterday we had the U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance, who spoke during a trip to India, where he essentially said that Washington was ready to walk away if the dialogue process, the peace process between Russia and Ukraine doesn't bear any fruit. Given that Washington could essentially turn its back on Ukraine, is that also why Kyiv is now looking for other partners?
Well, if we're analyzing the military support, the economic support, the countries which may impose the economic sanctions on Russia, definitely it's more about Europe, Canada, Japan, right? So in this sense, African countries will not substitute these countries, especially the US.
Yeah.
But again, as I have said, they may participate in other issues connected to the war, and their diplomatic solidarity is very, very important to denounce the aggression. So I think this approach may work, not to all African countries, definitely, because we know, by the way, that, for example, now there are pro-Russian countries in Sahel, from which France had to withdraw. Definitely, they are supported by Russia, and they will support Russian actions. But if you talk about many other African countries, it's different. Take, for example, such countries: Zambia, Kenya, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, and many other countries. They actually more on the Ukrainian side.
But there have been reports that the U.S. is mulling lifting certain sanctions on Russia. What happens then?
Look, first of all, we are discussing what may happen. Okay, so we are discussing different statements which seem to be not very wise, I would say, but these are statements from different people. Just recently, Trump continued the sanctions against Russia, which were imposed by previous administration. Okay, so far it works. We don't know what would happen. Yes, some statements from Trump administration, they are really, really disturbing. But if they do that, well, Ukrainians will continue to fight because we are fighting for our independence. Okay, and we have support, for example, from Europe, increasing support. Well, we understand right now that we cannot liberate by military means the occupied territories. We do not have enough arms. There's no enough pressure on Putin.
But Olexiy, I want to jump in there because
we are not going...
earlier today we had Ukraine's president who said he's not seeing any strong pressure on Russia to halt the invasion. But in the aftermath of Russia's invasion in Ukraine, we saw those swift sanctions that went into place, the EU suspending purchasing Russian oil and gas, what have you. But all that has still not shifted what Russia has done in Ukraine. They've managed to circumvent the sanctions. So at the end of the day, sanctions don't seem to have worked.
No. Come on. They work. Actually, the sanctions were too little and too late. But now, with position of Putin, who doesn't want ceasefire, with position of the United States, who are saying, well, Europe, do what you want. We are not going, to defend you. So now the position of Europe is started to change. They understand the importance of Ukraine. They understand that if Putin is not will be stopped in Ukraine, he will continue. Okay, so why Putin wants so much to remove the sanctions? Because they work. Okay, they should be increased. That's right. We are not sure if it happens. But look, let me come back to the red lines which Zelensky was talking about. Okay, so we are realizing we cannot liberate the occupied territories, but to recognize them as a Russian territory, to recognize Crimea as Russian one, no, it's a red line. And the international community do not accept it.
So then what is the alternative?
In the United Nations. So, by the way, Crimea was occupied by Russia at the end of 18th century, and Crimea wasn't Russian before that. And yes, there is a native people there who are Crimean Tatars who do not want to live under Russia. So there's no question that Crimea will remain legal.
Olexiy Haran, we're going to have to leave it there. I'm sorry to cut you off, but we're running out of time. Thank you for joining us on the program today.